Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. What city? What country? We want to know how far this story reaches. Because this is a story about a weapon so simple that plantation owners never considered it a threat. A walking stick, a shepherd's staff, a piece of oak wood carried by field hands and children. But in the hands of someone with 6 years to train, someone who understood leverage and striking points and the precise angle needed to shatter a kneecap or crush a windpipe, that simple stick became the most feared weapon in the Mississippi Delta. This is the story of Naomi Freeman. Age 13 when her campaign began, age 19 when it ended. 23 overseers dead. And she was never caught, never even suspected. They called her the Silent Death, the Shadow Striker, the Ghost with the Staff. But her real name was Naomi. And this is how a girl with a wooden stick brought terror to the men who terrorized her people. 23 men. That's how many overseers died in the Mississippi Delta between April 1852 and November 1858. 23 men who made their living controlling enslaved people through violence. 23 men who owned whips and guns and dogs. 23 men who rode through cotton fields enforcing the plantation system with systematic brutality. 23 men who beat human beings for working too slowly or speaking too freely or simply existing. 23 men killed by a wooden staff. Smooth oak wood 6 feet long, carved and hardened in fire, wielded with such precision that doctors examining the bodies found identical injuries. Shattered skulls, crushed windpipes, broken spines, necks snapped with surgical accuracy. 23 men who went to sleep in their plantation houses and never woke up. And the person who killed them was a girl, 13 years old when she started, trained in secret by her mother, who learned stick fighting in West Africa before being stolen and sold. A girl who understood that a staff is not just a walking aid, but a weapon capable of delivering devastating force from 6 feet of distance. Who learned that a properly executed strike to the temple requires only 12 pounds of pressure to kill instantly. Who practiced for 6 years until she could hit a specific knot on a tree from 15 feet away in complete darkness. For 6 years, overseers in the Mississippi Delta died mysteriously in their sleep or walking alone at night. Their bodies found with injuries that suggested someone had attacked them with incredible skill and vanished without trace. Plantation owners increased security, hired more guards, investigated endlessly. It didn't matter. The ghost never missed. The shadow striker was never seen. Until now. Until we tell you who she really was and how she learned to kill with such terrible perfection. Naomi Freeman was born enslaved in 1839 on the Whitmore Plantation in Bolivar County, Mississippi. 15,000 acres of cotton fields in the fertile Delta, where the soil was black and rich and the labor was backbreaking from sunrise to sunset. Her mother, Ayanna, had been stolen from what is now Senegal in 1831 at age 16, sold in Charleston, transported to Mississippi, and purchased by Robert Whitmore, who needed field hands for his expanding cotton operation. Ayanna was from the Wolof people, a culture where women learned to fight with staffs called takus, as both self-defense and ceremonial practice. She had trained since childhood in the movements, the strikes, the philosophy of turning a simple stick into an extension of your body and will. When she arrived at Whitmore Plantation, Ayanna hid this knowledge because showing combat skills would mark her as dangerous and get her sold or killed. But she never forgot. She practiced in secret, using walking sticks and hoe handles, maintaining her skills through thousands of repetitions performed when no one was watching. In 1838, Ayanna was forced to marry a man named Samuel, a carpenter enslaved on the same plantation. Samuel was gentle and kind, and Ayanna came to love him genuinely, despite the coercion of their union. In March 1839, Ayanna gave birth to a daughter they named Naomi. Samuel died of fever when Naomi was 3 years old. leaving Ayanna to raise the child alone while working in the cotton fields 14 hours a day under brutal supervision. Ayanna saw something special in Naomi from early age. The girl had perfect balance, could walk across narrow logs without hesitation, could climb trees with ease, had spatial awareness that seemed almost supernatural. When Naomi was 5, Ayanna began teaching her the taku in absolute secrecy. They would practice late at night in their cabin using broomsticks, or early in the morning before work using hoe handles. Ayanna taught Naomi the basic strikes: overhead swing to the crown of the skull, horizontal sweep to the knees, thrust to the solar plexus, upward strike under the chin. She taught her footwork, how to generate power from legs and hips rather than just arms, how to maintain balance while delivering maximum force. She taught her targeting, how to identify vulnerable points on the human body where even moderate force could disable or kill. Temples, throat, base of skull, spine, knees, groin. Most importantly, Ayanna taught Naomi the philosophy. The staff is not for showing off or fighting fairly. It is for ending threats as quickly and permanently as possible. You do not engage in combat. You strike once from ambush and you kill instantly. There is no honor in plantation violence. There is only survival and sometimes, if you're fortunate and skilled, revenge. Naomi absorbed these lessons like a sponge absorbs water. By age 8, she could execute the basic strikes with adult-level precision. By age 10, she could strike specific targets on a tree trunk from 10 feet away. By age 12, in 1851, she could hit a mark the size of a man's temple from 15 feet in darkness. Her strikes delivered so fast, the stick was a blur. Ayanna watched her daughter's skill develop with pride and fear. Pride that Naomi had mastered something powerful. Fear about what that power might demand. This is for protecting yourself, Ayanna told her again and again. Never for starting fights. Never for pride. You use this only when there's no choice. You understand? If you kill a white man, they'll murder everyone on this plantation. Everyone. Naomi understood. She was 12 years old in 1851. She had never thought about using her staff on people. Not yet. That thought would come 1 year later on an April morning in 1852 when everything changed. April 7th, 1852. Naomi was 13 years old. Her mother, Ayanna, was 37. They were working in the cotton fields when an overseer named William Crawford started beating a man named Jacob for picking cotton too slowly. Jacob was 62 years old, his hands crippled by arthritis, unable to move as fast as younger workers. Crawford beat him with a whip handle until Jacob fell unconscious. Then Crawford turned to the other field hands. "Anyone else want to work slow?" he asked. Ayanna Freeman stepped forward. She didn't shout or threaten. She simply said, "Sir, he's an old man. His hands don't work right. Please don't kill him for something he can't help." Crawford stared at Ayanna for 5 seconds. Then he said, "You telling me how to do my job, girl?" Ayanna kept her eyes down, her voice respectful. "No, sir. Just asking mercy for an old man who's worked these fields 40 years. Crawford pulled his pistol and shot Ayanna Freeman in the chest once. Point blank. Ayanna fell into the black Mississippi dirt and died while her 13-year-old daughter watched from 20 feet away. Naomi stood frozen, her cotton sack slipping from her hands. She watched her mother's blood soak into the soil, watched Crawford holster his pistol casually, watched the other enslaved people return to picking cotton because there was nothing else they could do, because helping meant dying too. Crawford looked around at the silent field hands. "Any other mouthy bitches want to speak up?" he said. No one answered. Crawford walked away. Naomi stood there for maybe 30 seconds longer. Then she turned and walked away from the field, not running, just walking steadily toward the slave quarters. An older woman named Ruth tried to stop her, tried to tell her she'd be whipped for leaving work. Naomi walked past without speaking. She went to the cabin she'd shared with her mother, the cabin that still smelled like Ayanna, like the herbs she used to make medicine, like the pine soap she made from tree sap. Naomi sat on the dirt floor and picked up her mother's walking staff, the 6-foot oak stick that Ayanna had carved and hardened and used for practicing when she thought no one was watching. Naomi held that staff and felt the smooth wood under her hands, wood worn smooth by thousands of hours of her mother's grip, wood that had taught her everything about fighting and killing. She sat there for hours as the sun moved across the sky. She sat there as the field hands returned at sunset. She sat there as darkness fell and the plantation settled into night. And when the sun rose on April 8th, 1852, Naomi Freeman was a different person. The girl who had learned to fight for self-defense was gone. In her place was someone who understood a simple truth. If the system would kill her mother for asking mercy for an old man, then the system needed to die. And since she couldn't kill the system, she would kill the people who enforced it. The overseers, the drivers, the men with whips who made slavery function through daily violence. Those men could be killed, and Naomi Freeman would kill them. She was 13 years old. She had a wooden staff and 6 years of training, and she had nothing left to lose. The first year after Ayanna's death, Naomi did not kill anyone. This was not mercy or hesitation. This was strategy. Naomi understood that killing required more than skill with a weapon. It required planning, intelligence gathering, and most critically, a way to kill without being caught. If she killed William Crawford immediately, everyone would know it was revenge, and she would be executed publicly as a warning. But if she waited, if she prepared, if she learned the patterns of overseers across multiple plantations, she could create a campaign of systematic elimination that would look like accidents or mysteries rather than deliberate murders. So Naomi spent that first year learning. She was assigned to work in the big house at Whitmore Plantation after her mother's death, doing cleaning and serving meals, a position that gave her access to information. She listened to conversations between Robert Whitmore and visiting plantation owners. She learned which overseers were considered cruel even by the standards of other slaveholders. She learned their names, their schedules, their habits. She learned that overseers often traveled alone between plantations to coordinate slave patrols. She learned that most overseers lived in small houses at the edges of plantation grounds, isolated from other white people. She learned that plantation owners assumed enslaved people were incapable of organized violence and rarely investigated suspicious deaths thoroughly. The first year after Ayanna's death, Naomi did not kill anyone. This was not mercy or hesitation. This was strategy. Naomi understood that killing required more than skill with a weapon. It required planning, intelligence gathering, and most critically, a way to kill without being caught. If she killed William Crawford immediately, everyone would know it was revenge and she would be executed publicly as a warning. But if she waited, if she prepared, if she learned the patterns of overseers across multiple plantations, she could create a campaign of systematic elimination that would look like accidents or mysteries rather than deliberate murders. So Naomi spent that first year learning. She was assigned to work in the big house at Whitmore Plantation after her mother's death, doing cleaning and serving meals, a position that gave her access to information. She listened to conversations between Robert Whitmore and visiting plantation owners. She learned which overseers were considered cruel even by the standards of other slaveholders. She learned their names, their schedules, their habits. She learned that overseers often traveled alone between plantations to coordinate slave patrols. She learned that most overseers lived in small houses at the edges of plantation grounds, isolated from other white people. She learned that plantation owners assumed enslaved people were incapable of organized violence and rarely investigated suspicious deaths thoroughly. While gathering this intelligence, Naomi continued training in secret with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every night after the big house was asleep, usually between midnight and 3 a.m., she would take her mother's staff and disappear into the woods behind the slave quarters. She had identified a clearing 200 yards into the forest where sound wouldn't carry back to the plantation. In that clearing, she practiced the killing arts her mother had taught her, the basic overhead strike, bringing the staff down vertically onto a target's crown with maximum force. Naomi practiced this strike 10,000 times that first year, until her arms ached and her hands bled, and the motion became as automatic as breathing. She learned that the key to power was not arm strength, but full body rotation, using legs and hips to generate force, the staff acting as a lever to multiply that force at the point of impact. She learned that a properly executed overhead strike could generate over 800 pounds of force at impact, enough to shatter a human skull like porcelain. The horizontal sweep, swinging the staff parallel to the ground to strike knees or ribs or skulls. This required different footwork, pivoting on the back foot while stepping with the front, maintaining balance while delivering devastating lateral force. Naomi practiced against tree trunks of various diameters, learning how different targets absorbed impact differently. A 4-inch sapling would bend under the strike. A 2-foot oak trunk would absorb the blow with minimal damage. A human leg fell somewhere between those extremes, bone and muscle that would crack under sufficient force applied to the right angle. The thrust, driving the end of the staff forward like a spear into throat or solar plexus or groin. This was the fastest strike, covering distance in fractions of a second, useful when an opponent was approaching head-on. Naomi learned to thrust from various stances, from standing still, from moving backward, from kneeling position. She practiced against fence posts and hanging sacks, learning the precise angle needed to penetrate rather than glance off. The upward strike under the chin, lifting the staff from low position to drive the end upward into the vulnerable underside of the jaw or throat. This was devastating when executed properly, but required being very close to the target, within arm's reach. Naomi practiced this strike less frequently, because getting that close to an overseer meant exposing herself to grab or gunshot. But she mastered it nonetheless, because every technique had potential applications she couldn't foresee. Beyond the basic strikes, Naomi taught herself advanced techniques through trial and error. She learned to strike while moving, maintaining accuracy while running or walking. She learned to strike from unconventional positions, from lying down, from kneeling behind cover, from elevated positions like tree branches. She learned to use the environment, positioning herself so that a missed strike would hit a wall or tree rather than dissipating into empty air, maintaining momentum for a follow-up. Most importantly, she learned to strike in complete darkness. She would practice on moonless nights when the forest was pitch black, learning to locate targets by sound and spatial memory rather than vision, delivering strikes that hit precise points on tree trunks she could not see. This skill would prove critical because most of her kills would occur at night when darkness provided cover. By April 1853, 1 year after her mother's death, Naomi was ready. She had identified her first target, William Crawford, the overseer who had murdered Ayanna. She had studied his patterns for a year. Crawford lived in a small house 200 yards from the Whitmore big house. He drank heavily every night, usually passing out by 10 p.m. His house had a front door and a back window that he left open for ventilation. The window was large enough for a 13-year-old girl to climb through. On April 7th, 1853, exactly 1 year after Ayanna's murder, Naomi waited until midnight. The plantation was dark and silent. She took her mother's staff and moved through the shadows to Crawford's house. She listened at the window until she heard snoring. Then she climbed through the window with practiced silence, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Crawford was sleeping on his back in his bed, mouth open, reeking of whiskey. Naomi stood beside the bed, holding her staff horizontal at shoulder height. She looked at Crawford's face, the man who had shot her mother for asking mercy. She felt nothing. No rage, no satisfaction, just cold focus. She raised the staff above her head with both hands, brought it down with all her strength directly onto Crawford's forehead. The sound was like a watermelon cracking. Crawford's skull fractured. He died instantly, without waking. Naomi climbed back out the window and returned to her cabin. She hid the staff under her bed and lay down. She did not sleep. She waited for dawn. When Crawford's body was discovered the next morning, the initial assumption was natural death, perhaps a stroke. But the doctor who examined the body found the fractured skull and declared it suspicious. Robert Whitmore ordered an investigation. The sheriff questioned all enslaved people about whether anyone had heard or seen anything unusual. Everyone said no. The sheriff examined Crawford's house for signs of robbery or struggle. He found the open window, but assumed Crawford had left it open himself. The case was filed as unsolved murder, possibly committed by an unknown intruder. Naomi was never suspected because the idea of a 13-year-old enslaved girl climbing through a window and killing a grown man with a stick seemed impossible. This would be the pattern for the next 5 years. Between April 1853 and November 1858, Naomi Freeman killed 22 more overseers using various methods. Each kill planned meticulously and executed with surgical precision. The second kill came in September 1853, 5 months after Crawford. The target was James Morrison, an overseer at the Henderson plantation known for raping enslaved women. Morrison lived in a house near the edge of the plantation, a quarter-mile from the nearest neighbor. He walked home alone every night after checking the slave quarters, always taking the same path through a cotton field. Naomi studied this pattern for 3 weeks. On September 23rd, she positioned herself in the cotton field along Morrison's route. Lying flat between rows of cotton plants, her staff held horizontal at ground level. At 10 p.m., Morrison walked past, carrying a lantern, whistling. Naomi waited until he was 3 steps past her position, then swept her staff hard against the back of his knees. Morrison fell forward, his lantern flying. Before he could recover, Naomi delivered a downward strike to the base of his skull. The impact severed his spinal cord. He died instantly, without seeing his attacker. Naomi disappeared into darkness, leaving Morrison's body in the cotton field where it was found at dawn. The death was ruled accidental, a fall that resulted in fatal head injury. The third kill, December 1853, targeted an overseer named Robert Hayes at the Carlisle plantation. Hayes was paranoid about the mysterious deaths and slept with his door barred and windows locked. But Hayes had a routine. Every morning at 5 a.m. before dawn, he would walk to the plantation well to wash his face. The well was in a small building with a roof but open sides. Naomi waited in the rafters of that building from 4 a.m. until Hayes arrived. When Hayes bent over the well to splash water on his face, Naomi dropped from the rafters and drove her staff downward into Hayes's spine between his shoulder blades. The force was so great, it cracked 2 vertebrae. Hayes collapsed paralyzed, unable to move or cry out. Naomi delivered a second strike to his temple to ensure death. She climbed back into the rafters and waited 30 minutes before leaving to ensure no one else was nearby. Hayes's body was found 2 hours later. The death was mysterious, but not obviously murder, because the wounds could have been caused by falling from the rafters onto the well's stone edge. The 4th through 10th kills between 1854 and 1855 followed similar patterns of patient observation, followed by precise execution. Kill 4 was Peter Manning, overseer at Westwood Plantation, ambushed while riding alone at night, struck from tree branch as he passed underneath, skull fractured, dead before hitting ground. Kill 5 was Samuel Brooks, overseer at Riverside Plantation, killed in his sleep like Crawford, throat crushed by horizontal strike, died without waking. Kill 6 was David Walsh, overseer at Morrison Plantation where Naomi had been born, killed while bathing alone in a creek at dawn, thrust to base of skull as he dunked his head underwater, body found hours later when he didn't report for work. Kill 7 was Thomas Reed, overseer at Henderson Plantation, killed in a barn while doing evening inspection, horizontal sweep to back of head while he examined equipment, dead before his body stopped moving. Kill 8 was Michael Stone, overseer at Whitfield Plantation, killed while walking between quarters and his house at midnight, ambushed from behind Cotton Gin Building, downward strike to crown of head, skull shattered, dead instantly. Kill 9 was Charles Whitmore, overseer at Carlisle Plantation and nephew of Robert Whitmore, who owned the plantation where Naomi lived. Killed in his sleep using window entry method, single overhead strike to forehead. Brain damage massive and instantly fatal. Kill 10 was Edward Patterson, overseer at Morrison Plantation, no relation to Marcus Patterson who would be killed later, ambushed while checking on slave quarters at night, thrust to throat from behind doorway, windpipe collapsed, suffocated within seconds. Each kill refined Naomi's technique. Each kill taught her something about human vulnerability, about how bodies responded to impact, about how to kill efficiently without excessive force that might leave evidence or noise. By kill 10, she had reduced her method to pure mathematics. Identify vulnerable moment, position for optimal strike angle, execute with precisely calculated force, verify death, disappear. The emotional toll was significant, but manageable. Naomi did not enjoy killing. She felt no pleasure in watching men die. But she also felt no guilt because every man she killed had chosen to make his living through violence against enslaved people. They had chosen to be overseers, knowing what that role required. They had beaten and raped and murdered people who could not defend themselves. Naomi simply ended their ability to continue that violence. She was not judge and jury because slavery provided no courts for justice. She was executioner, acting on behalf of her murdered mother and everyone else who suffered under overseer brutality. This moral certainty sustained her through 6 years and 23 kills. The bodies were always found hours or days later with identical injuries. Massive skull fractures, crushed windpipes, shattered spines. Doctors were baffled. The injuries suggested someone with extraordinary strength and skill. Plantation owners became paranoid. Some hired bodyguards for their overseers. Some installed locks and bars on windows. Some theorized that a gang of escaped slaves was conducting organized attacks. None of these measures helped because Naomi was patient enough to wait for any security to relax, small enough to slip through spaces that seemed too narrow for a human, and skilled enough to kill in seconds of absolute silence. By 1856, 3 years into her campaign, Naomi had killed 14 overseers across 5 different plantations in Bolivar County. The psychological impact was enormous. Overseers were harder to hire because the position had become deadly. Some overseers quit and left Mississippi entirely. Those who remained were constantly afraid, sleeping with loaded guns, traveling in pairs, jumping at shadows. Plantation owners met to discuss the mysterious deaths. Some blamed vengeful spirits or curses. Some blamed abolitionists sending assassins from the north. No one suspected a teenage enslaved girl because the idea seemed absurd. But Naomi's campaign was not without complications. In July 1856, she attempted to kill an overseer named Thomas Blake at the Henderson plantation. She had waited in a barn where Blake did evening inspections. When Blake entered, Naomi struck from behind with a thrust to his spine. But Blake had turned at the last second, perhaps sensing movement, and the strike hit his shoulder blade instead of his spine. Blake staggered and shouted. Naomi ran. She escaped through a back door and vanished into darkness before Blake could identify her. Blake survived with a shattered shoulder, but could not describe his attacker except to say it was someone smaller than expected. This near discovery forced Naomi to be even more cautious. For 6 months after the Blake incident, she killed no one, waiting for the heightened security to relax. When she resumed in January 1857, she was even more meticulous in her planning. The Blake incident taught her that even perfect preparation could fail if the target moved unpredictably. She began accounting for this by choosing targets who had predictable routines, and by positioning herself to strike even if the target moved. The internal conflict during these years was crushing. Naomi was not a natural killer. She dreamed about her mother constantly, reliving Ayanna's death, hearing the gunshot, seeing the blood. She woke many nights with silent screams trapped in her throat, because making sound would bring questions. She carried the weight of 23 deaths in her mind, faces she had seen in the moment of killing, the wet crack of skulls breaking, the final exhales. Sometimes she wondered if her mother would approve of what she was doing. Ayanna had taught her to fight for self-defense, not for revenge. But Ayanna was also the woman who had trained a child to kill with surgical precision, who had taught that violence was sometimes the only response to oppression. Naomi believed her mother would understand. The killing was not sadistic pleasure, but cold mathematics. Every dead overseer was one less enforcer of slavery. Every overseer's death made the position less attractive to potential replacements. Every mysterious murder created fear among those who profited from enslaved labor. Naomi was conducting guerrilla warfare as a teenager, using the only weapon available to her, fighting the only way possible for someone who was property in the eyes of the law. The moral complexity of this haunted her, but did not stop her. By 1858, Naomi was 19 years old and had killed 23 overseers over 5.5 years. She had transformed from a 13-year-old girl to a ghost that haunted the nightmares of every overseer in Bolivar County. But maintaining this double life was exhausting. During the day, Naomi worked in the Whitmore big house as a servant, quiet and obedient and unremarkable. At night, she became death incarnate, moving through darkness with her mother's staff to strike at the men who made slavery possible through violence. The final kill came in November 1858. The target was an overseer named Marcus Patterson, different from the man who killed Ayanna, but with the same first name, a coincidence that felt like fate to Naomi. Marcus Patterson was known as one of the cruelest overseers in the county, a man who beat enslaved people for entertainment, who separated families as punishment, who raped women with impunity. He had been hired recently at a plantation bordering Whitmore's land. Naomi spent 2 months studying Patterson's patterns. He lived alone in a house at the edge of the plantation. He drank every evening until he passed out. He kept his windows locked, but his back door had a faulty latch that could be opened from outside with a thin piece of wood. On November 14th, 1858, Naomi waited until 2 a.m. She approached Patterson's house in complete darkness, moving by memory and feel. She used a piece of kindling to manipulate the door latch. The door swung open silently. Inside, Patterson was snoring in his bed, drunk and vulnerable. Naomi stood beside him, holding her staff. She thought about her mother. She thought about all the people Patterson had hurt. She thought about the 22 overseers she had already killed. Then she raised the staff and brought it down onto Patterson's throat with precise force. His windpipe collapsed instantly. He woke for a few seconds, choking, unable to breathe or cry out. His eyes were wide with terror and confusion. He saw a shadow standing over him, but could not identify who it was. He died within 30 seconds. Naomi stood there for a moment, looking at Patterson's body. 23. She had killed 23 overseers in 5.5 years. 23 men who would never beat or rape or murder anyone again. She felt tired. Not regret, just exhaustion. She left through the back door, secured the latch behind her, and walked back to the slave quarters. She hid her mother's staff in its usual place under her bed. She lay down and closed her eyes. And for the first time in 5.5 years, she slept without dreaming. The next morning, Patterson's body was discovered. The investigation followed the familiar pattern. Mysterious death, identical injuries to previous cases, no evidence, no suspects. But this time something was different. A new sheriff had been appointed in Bolivar County in October 1858. A man named James Cooper, who was more thorough than his predecessor. Cooper examined all 23 unsolved overseer deaths and noticed patterns. All killed with blunt force trauma to skull or throat. All killed when alone at night. All killed without witnesses or physical evidence, except the injuries themselves. Cooper theorized that one person was responsible for all 23 murders. But Cooper's investigation led nowhere because he made the same assumption everyone else made. The killer must be a large, strong man, probably an escaped slave hiding in the woods, using a club or similar weapon. Cooper organized search parties to comb the forests around the plantations where murders had occurred. They found nothing because Naomi was not hiding in the woods. She was living in plain sight, working in the Whitmore Big House, seemingly harmless. The investigation eventually stalled. Cooper remained convinced the murders were connected, but could not identify a suspect. The case stayed open, but inactive, and Naomi made a decision. She would stop killing. Not from fear of being caught, though that was a factor, but because she was exhausted. She had avenged her mother 23 times over. She had created enough fear among overseers to change the system slightly, making the position less attractive, making plantation owners think twice about unchecked brutality. She could not destroy slavery alone with a wooden staff, but she had proven that enslaved people could fight back, that the enforcers of oppression were not invulnerable. That was enough. For the next 6.5 years, from November 1858 to April 1865, when the Civil War ended slavery, Naomi lived quietly at Whitmore Plantation. She worked as a house servant, she avoided attention, she kept her mother's staff hidden. She was 26 years old when emancipation came. She had killed 23 men between ages 13 and 19. And she was never caught, never suspected, never punished. After emancipation, Naomi left Mississippi. She traveled north to Ohio and settled in Cleveland. She found work as a seamstress. She lived alone in a small apartment. She spoke rarely about her past. In 1873, age 34, she married a man named William Davis, a carpenter who had been enslaved in Virginia and had escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad in 1857. They had 3 children over the next 10 years. Naomi never told William about the 23 kills. She never told anyone. She carried that knowledge alone, locked behind layers of normalcy and domesticity. But the weight never fully left. She dreamed about her mother, about the moment Ayanna was shot, about the 13-year-old girl who watched it happen and decided to become a weapon. She dreamed about the faces of the men she had killed, the sound of bones breaking, the stillness after death. These dreams visited her for decades, not every night, but often enough to remind her of what she had done and why. In September 1897, Naomi Freeman Davis, age 58, was diagnosed with consumption. The disease progressed rapidly. By March 1898, she was bedridden, too weak to work, coughing blood into rags. She knew she was dying. Her husband William sat beside her bed every day, holding her hand, reading to her, caring for her with devotion that moved her deeply. On April 6, 1898, 46 years to the day before her mother was murdered, Naomi asked William to bring her something from the attic. A long bundle wrapped in old cloth, something she had carried from Mississippi and kept hidden for decades. William retrieved the bundle and unwrapped it in front of Naomi. Inside was a 6-foot oak staff, smooth and dark with age, carved with intricate patterns. "What is this?" William asked. Naomi looked at the staff, her mother's staff, the weapon that had killed 23 men. She told William everything. She told him about Ayanna's murder, about the 13 months of preparation, about the 6 years of systematic killing, about the 23 overseers who died by her hand, about the staff that had been her mother's and then hers and had delivered death with surgical precision. William listened without interruption. When Naomi finished, she asked, "Are you horrified? Do you think I'm a monster?" William thought for a long time before answering. Then he said, "I think you were a child who watched your mother be murdered for asking mercy. I think you did what you had to do to survive and to fight back. I think 23 dead overseers is 23 fewer monsters in the world. I think you were braver than most people could ever be. And I think your mother would be proud." Naomi cried for the first time in decades, tears streaming down her face while William held her hand. She died the next morning, April 7th, 1898, 46 years to the day after Ayanna Freeman was shot for asking mercy for an old man. Naomi was 58 years old. She had been enslaved for the first 26 years of her life. She had spent 6 of those years as a guerrilla fighter using a wooden staff to kill the men who enforced slavery through violence. She had spent the next 32 years living free, working, raising children, carrying the weight of 23 deaths in silence. Before she died, Naomi made William promise to burn the staff. "Don't keep it," she said. "Don't pass it down. Let it end with me." William honored that promise. After Naomi's burial, he burned the staff in his fireplace, watching the oak wood that had killed 23 men turn to ash and smoke. But William also did something Naomi had not requested. He wrote down her confession, every detail she had told him, and he sealed it in an envelope with instructions that it should not be opened until after his own death. William Davis died in 1921 at age 83. His children found the sealed envelope among his possessions. They opened it and read Naomi's confession, written in William's careful handwriting. They were shocked and disturbed and fascinated. Their mother, the quiet seamstress who had made their clothes and taught them to read, had killed 23 men with a stick when she was a teenager. The confession detailed every kill, dates, names of victims, methods used, reasons for targeting each overseer. It was meticulous and horrifying and undeniable. William's youngest daughter, Sarah, was a teacher and amateur historian. She recognized the historical significance of the confession. In 1923, she published Naomi's story in a small black newspaper called The Cleveland Advocate. In a series of articles titled The Girl with the Staff, How One Enslaved Child Fought Back Against Overseers. The articles described Naomi's 6-year campaign in detail. The training from her mother, the 13 months of preparation, the 23 kills, the methods and motivations. White newspapers in Mississippi denounced the articles as fabricated propaganda designed to inflame racial tensions. But the facts were verifiable. 23 overseers had indeed died mysteriously in Bolivar County between 1852 and 1858. The deaths had indeed shown identical injuries, suggesting a skilled attacker. The cases had never been solved. Naomi Freeman had been real. Her mother, Ayanna, had been murdered by William Crawford in April 1852, and Naomi had lived in Cleveland from 1865 until her death in 1898. The confession was probably true. Sarah Davis preserved her grandfather William's handwritten document and deposited it with the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland in 1928. That document still exists today in their archives. You can read Naomi's confession yourself, describing how she learned to fight with a staff, how she planned each ambush, how she felt watching overseers die, how she carried the weight of 23 deaths for 46 years. The historical significance of Naomi Freeman's story extends beyond the body count. Yes, 23 dead overseers over 6 years is remarkable. Yes, starting at age 13 is extraordinary. Yes, never being caught despite intensive investigations is nearly impossible. But the deeper impact is what Naomi represented. Proof that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting for liberation from outside forces. That resistance could take forms that were strategic and sustained, rather than spontaneous rebellions that were quickly crushed. That one person with skill and determination could fight back effectively against a system designed to make resistance impossible. Naomi Freeman was not leading armies or conducting large-scale rebellions. She was a teenage girl with a wooden stick, systematically eliminating the men who made slavery function through daily violence. She was conducting asymmetric warfare decades before that term existed, using mobility and stealth and precision strikes to neutralize targets who had superior numbers and firepower, but who never expected an attack from a 13-year-old house servant. The psychological impact of her campaign was significant. Even though no one knew who was killing overseers, the fact that overseers were dying mysteriously created fear among those who enforced slavery. The fear made recruitment harder, made existing overseers more cautious, and sent a message to enslaved people that resistance was possible even if liberation seemed impossible. Whether Naomi's actions were morally justified is a question each person must answer for themselves. She killed 23 men, most of them while they slept or were otherwise vulnerable, using overwhelming force from ambush. By any legal standard, these were murders. But Naomi was enslaved. Her mother was murdered for asking mercy, and she had no legal recourse or political power or way to resist except through violence. Does that change the moral calculation? She was 13 years old when she started. She watched her mother shot for speaking. She spent 13 months preparing rather than acting impulsively. She targeted only overseers, the specific men who enforced slavery through violence, rather than indiscriminately killing white people. She fought for 6 years with discipline and planning, rather than rage and chaos. Does that make her a freedom fighter rather than a murderer? History does not judge. History only records. Naomi Freeman killed 23 overseers between 1852 and 1858 using a 6-foot oak staff. This is documented fact. Whether this was justified resistance or murder, whether it advanced freedom or added to suffering, each person decides for themselves. What is undeniable is that Naomi acted, that she refused to accept her mother's murder passively, that she made a choice to fight back even when the cost could have been her life, that she succeeded for 6 years against impossible odds, and that she lived 32 more years as a free woman before dying surrounded by family who loved her. Naomi Freeman died April 7th, 1898 in Cleveland, Ohio. She was 58 years old. She had been enslaved for 26 years. She had borne no children while enslaved because she refused to bring children into slavery. She had been educated by her mother in combat that saved her life and enabled her revenge. She used that education to kill 23 men who made slavery possible through violence. She was never caught, convicted, or punished. She married, had 3 children, worked as a seamstress for 30 years, and died in her own bed, holding her husband's hand. Remember Naomi Freeman. Remember that she was 13 years old when she started. Remember that her mother, Ayanna, was shot for asking an overseer to stop beating a 62-year-old man with arthritis. Remember that Naomi spent 13 months preparing before taking her first life, training every night to achieve perfect precision. Remember that she killed 23 men in 6 years and was never caught. Remember that her weapon was a 6-foot oak staff her mother had carved and taught her to use. Remember that she created terror with something plantation owners considered a simple walking stick. Remember that she made the overseer position so dangerous that recruitment became difficult across an entire county. Remember that she fought for 6 years as a teenager with discipline that most adults could never sustain. Remember that she lived 32 more years as a free woman, raised children, worked honestly, and died surrounded by family. Remember that the system tried to break her by murdering her mother and failed. Remember that one person with skill and determination and absolute commitment can make a difference. Remember that resistance takes many forms. Remember that justice sometimes arrives 6 feet of hardened oak at a time. Remember Naomi Freeman, the ghost with the staff. Born enslaved 1839, died free 1898. Age 13 when her campaign began, age 19 when it ended. 23 overseers dead, and she was never caught. Before we end, tell us in the comments what you think. Was Naomi Freeman justified? Was she a freedom fighter or a murderer? Could you have done what she did at age 13? Share this story. Let people know that resistance happened in ways textbooks never mention. Let people know that a teenage girl with a wooden stick fought back against slavery and won. Let people know that Naomi Freeman existed and that her mother's death was not in vain. Remember her name. Remember her story. Remember that freedom was not given, it was taken, one strike at a time, by people brave enough to fight when fighting seemed impossible. The story continues. Never forget. Never stop fighting. Never accept injustice. Naomi Freeman showed us how. 23 strikes. 23 overseers who thought they were safe because they had whips and guns and the law on their side. 23 men who never saw the staff that killed them. 23 men who learned too late that a trained 13-year-old girl with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than any weapon they could imagine. Naomi Freeman, age 13 to 19, 23 kills, 6 years, never caught. Remember her.